need to both honor the protesters in the moment and also know that protest works. That the ability of protest to provide cover for people who want to do something but fear that they might be out over their skis, brings people out in the streets, reminds people that there's an issue out there they want to fight for their brothers and sisters who might have less ability to fight for it than they do. Protest works.
Welcome to the Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. As the nation approaches its 250th anniversary, a new book celebrates one of our country's foundational principles, the right to protest. My guests today are Annie Leonard and André Carothers, co-authors of Protest, Respect It, Defend It, Use It. The veteran activists argue that the very right to protest is under attack. They have direct experience of the power of protest and the ferocity of the pushback. Annie Leonard spent 17 years with Greenpeace US, serving as executive director from 2014 to 2023. She also created the viral documentary The Story of Stuff, and she co-launched the Jane Fonda Climate PAC and has campaigned widely on a range of environmental and democracy-related issues. André Carothers spent 13 years with Greenpeace US, including 4 on the board of directors. He co-founded and led the Rockwood Leadership Institute for a dozen years and has served as a board member of the Center for Investigative Reporting, Rainforest Action Network, and other groups. Anti-protest laws have become increasingly repressive, such as charging activists with felonies and accusing them of terrorism. Among the most draconian of recent anti-protest actions was a lawsuit against Greenpeace filed by Energy Transfers that accused Greenpeace of organizing protests that delayed construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Last year, a North Dakota jury awarded Energy Transfers $660 million, which was reduced earlier this year to a still staggering $345 million. This threatens the very existence of Greenpeace. I asked Annie Leonard to explain what happened in the case and to put it in the context of other threats to protest.
So our ability to protest is key to moving forward progress on a whole range of environmental and social issues. And I have especially engaged in protest on environmental issues, which is why I'm so terrified at the thought of losing this democratic right. So in the case, the Energy Transfers case, Energy Transfers is the fossil fuel company that built the Dakota Access Pipeline through Standing Rock. And many people saw the huge protest. Some of the people there said it wasn't a protest, it was a prayer, but saw the huge gathering, peaceful gathering of water protectors that were working to protect the Standing Rock Sioux's water, land, and way of life. So Energy Transfers sued Greenpeace for, originally it was over $300 million, claiming that Greenpeace orchestrated that gigantic indigenous-led movement at Standing Rock, that we encouraged violence there, that we were responsible for the delays. I say we because I was the executive director at the time. I'm no longer connected to the organization. But the lawsuit came when I was the director, and it was really jarring to receive this lawsuit for over $300 million. This lawsuit is a particular kind of lawsuit called a SLAP suit. SLAP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation.
Which in its very name is telling.
Exactly.
A lawsuit against public participation. I think that might surprise a lot of people that such a law with such a name exists.
And that's actually why a lot of states do have anti-SLAP legislation, because these SLAP suits are not legitimate lawsuits. They are meritless lawsuits. They are not designed to make it to court, to win in court, although very occasionally they do, as in this case. They are designed to intimidate, silence, scare, distract, and bankrupt critics. And SLAPs have been used by all kinds of powerful interests, especially extractive corporations, mining companies, fossil fuel companies, but also powerful individuals. It's a kind of corporate legal bullying. And most people in organizations, when you get served a SLAP suit for $100 million or $300 million, most organizations say, okay, we'll stop the campaign because you don't have the money for a lawyer. Greenpeace realized that Greenpeace holds a particular role in the sort of environmental ecosystem, that it's an organization that was born in an act of protest. It's known for being courageous, for speaking truth to power. And so we thought we have to fight this, even though the legal bills were enormous. And we did fight it. And it went to court last year in North Dakota, an oil dominated state that does not have anti SLAPP protections. And sadly, Greenpeace lost. I was the lead witness in that case, so I stood on that witness stand. And it was just a horrible experience because it was almost like a science fiction film or something where the truth had nothing to do with what was going on. The sense that I left with was that a lot of local people were angry about the Standing Rock protests. It was very disruptive. They felt invaded, and they wanted someone to blame. And this was the first time they got someone to blame. So Greenpeace is now facing a $300 million verdict, which is many times more than how much money Greenpeace has in the bank. They are appealing, and I wish them well. I will say, though, that although Greenpeace says this is an existential threat, I just want to remind people that Greenpeace is so much more than a corporate entity. And while this lawsuit may take away the corporate entity, the Greenpeace spirit lives on in millions of people around this country. And those people will continue to stand up and be courageous, in the face of corporate legal bullying. So on one level, it's an existential threat. On another level, you can't really silence Greenpeace.
Annie, is Greenpeace going to survive this lawsuit?
I don't know. I certainly hope that they will get an appeal and that the judge will do the right thing. During the entire over a month-long trial, Energy Transfers presented no hard evidence of their claim. And in fact, the idea that Greenpeace orchestrated that is incredibly offensive to the indigenous leadership that was there. I mean, it was very clearly an indigenous-led protest. So I hope they will prevail. But if they don't prevail, I do want to, again, point out that Greenpeace is so much more than a 501c3 organization. Greenpeace really is an orientation of the spirit. And if that particular corporate entity goes away, the resistance will not. So these SLAPP suits really are a futile effort to try to silence people who care deeply about protecting the planet and the people that we share it with.
André, in your book, you outline, these SLAPP suits, lawsuits, what have you, are only one tactic to stop protest. Talk about some of the other ways that protesters are now having to fight against, even to have their voice of opposition heard.
Well, historically, the US government cracked down on protesters, people who oppose government policy. It's not particularly new, particularly for our Black and brown and indigenous brothers and sisters. Going back to the 19th century, the slavery, anti-slavery protests, through to the creation of unions, through to the pre-World War II condemnation of people who fought for more justice around then, right through to now. It's an old story. At the same time, I think it's fair to say what you're seeing now is a much more amplified effort by the US government to silence and undermine critics. It begins in some ways with 9/11 and the Patriot Act and the various legislative maneuvers that were bipartisan at the time under the rubric of creating safety in the United States. But in the last 5 or 6 years, you've seen lawfare, what they call lawfare, legislative efforts across the board to limit, essentially put barbed wire around the public square. There is prosecutors who are doing charge aggregation, bringing in theories that were first used to prosecute the mafia, to bring together various legal efforts to really make it dangerous in some ways for people to protest. There's a story right now happening in San Francisco, some protesters who blocked the Golden Gate Bridge to protest what was happening in Gaza a couple of years ago. The exact same kind of protest was done by the AIDS ACT UP people 30 years ago. The bridge was blocked, the police cleared the bridge, they were charged with misdemeanors, and life went on. The particular people who did this protest about 2 years ago are being charged with things like conspiracy, for unlawful imprisonment because of the people who were stuck in their cars for a few hours. And this kind of, I guess what they call lawfare, different techniques to bring the law heavily down on people, is a very has a very chilling effect on what's available to people.
I have personal experience of this. When I was in college, I was very involved in anti-apartheid protests against apartheid in South Africa. And, we shut down the university. We were in the university president's face. And I wrote an op-ed about this in the Boston Globe last year as I watched the student protesters today protesting what's going on in Gaza. As these students were being expelled, suspended, arrested, we never imagined there would be sanctions for protesting on a university campus, which is supposedly, a sanctuary of free speech. And I recounted how we were engaged in a 4-year-long argument with the college president, which I thought was normal. I thought that's what you did at college. He believed emphatically that we were very wrong. And of course, we believed that he was very wrong. And that argument raged. But the protesters today are facing, I'm sure many students, and particularly vulnerable students, international students, really question whether it's worth raising their hand to object to something. Annie, I wonder if you could just speak to that. Do you find, you're going around doing these trainings, protest trainings, that people are just fearful to do anything? How do you encourage people to get over that fear to speak out?
I too protested against apartheid in South Africa, and I remember sleeping out on the steps of Hamilton Hall at Columbia University, the very same steps where the Gaza protesters were just brutally assaulted. I mean, it's incredible, the double standard and the hypocrisy. I think people are scared, and rightfully. This is a very scary time. We are seeing our imperfect but relatively stable democracy and our democratic norms and rules and practices being undermined. So previously, when activists were weighing the potential risks of engaging in different kinds of protest and civil disobedience or free speech, we basically knew what the rules were. We knew the rules were largely unfair, but they were pretty stable. You could assess what the potential risks are. All of that is out the window right now. You have people engaging in constitutionally protected free speech and peaceful assembly being charged with felonies, being locked up. The charge aggregation that André mentioned, were being accused of being terrorists and conspiracy. It is a very, very scary moment. At the same time, I am seeing, as we travel around the country doing these book events and freedom trainers workshops, an incredible courage, an incredible sense of solidarity. When Alex Pretty was shot on the streets in Minneapolis, one would think that might make people want to stay inside. There were Ice Watch trainings the following days over Zoom. Over 200,000 people signed up for that. We saw in Minneapolis the people coming out in their bathrobes, blocking ICE vehicles even after their neighbors had been shot and killed. So yes, it is a scary time, but the solidarity, the commitment, the sense of justice, the sense that what we are seeing is not the direction that we want this country to go in is so strong and inspiring. And, we quote the historian Timothy Snyder in our book, where he said, "If you protest now, you will be able to protest later." And I think people know that. This is not the time to sit on the sidelines. That said, if you're not a U.S. citizen, if you have other identities that make you particularly a target, you might want to choose a different kind of protest than you would have previously. There's an infinite number of ways to protest. So you have to pick responsibly, but There's no way the American people are going to be cowed and scared and sit this one out.
So your book is in fact filled with stories of protest and gorgeous photos. Annie, I want to ask you about one of them that you were involved in, and that's the kayaktivists. And people may remember in 2015, the sight of all these colorful kayaks bobbing in the Puget Sound or where, off of Seattle. And they were protesting Shell Oil's plans to drill in the Arctic at that time. These protests kind of replicated in a bunch of other locations. Shell ultimately canceled its $7 billion Arctic drilling program. Talk about what were the ingredients of that action that made it successful.
Oh, I loved that action, and partly because it did have so many of those ingredients. One reason is that the protests itself, both the kayaktivists in the bay in Seattle and then the activists hanging off the bridge in Portland blocking another Shell ship that needed to get up to the Arctic, those didn't happen in a vacuum. Those were part of a long, intentional, escalating campaign. And one of the things that makes protest most effective is if it's embedded in a deeper strategy. I like to say that making change is like laying a stone path across the garden. And protest maybe every fourth or eighth or 200th stone, but you need the other steps as well. And so in the case of the kayaktivists, what happened is that Shell Oil's just monstrosity of an oil drilling rig, the Polar Pioneer, was based in the port of Seattle.
One of the kayakers described it as like looking up at the Death Star.
Oh, yeah. It helped us that it was just monstrosity looking. I mean, it was just terrifying. It's huge, horrible thing. Also, whoever picked Seattle at Shell Oil did not know their protest history because people in the Pacific Northwest know how to protest. But even before the Shell oil rig got to Seattle, there had been years of lawsuits, of public education, of hundreds of thousands of people contacting the Department of the Interior to deny the permit. There was so much activity. I like to say that the best protests, people already know about the issue before they see the protest in the news. And there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who had been on the journey of trying to stop Arctic drilling before this instance happened. Another reason that it was very successful was that the indigenous communities in Alaska who were going to bear the brunt of the oil drilling were very much involved. They came down from Alaska, they joined with indigenous groups locally in the Pacific Northwest, and they had these beautiful longboats that they led the kayaks in, these gorgeous indigenous longboats. So it was very diverse participation. A number of organizations, the Mosquito Fleet, Backbone Campaign, Greenpeace 350, had every weekend family kayak training in the bay and got a whole bunch of kayak rentals to donate the rentals. So people had the muscle memory. They knew how to get out in the bay, fill the bay with kayaks. There were community meetings and art builds. It was a very inclusive and participatory set of activities, for a couple of years leading up to filling the actual bay with kayaks to try to stop the Polar Pioneer from moving forward.
It's so interesting how you describe this, like building a stone pathway. You quote an activist named Bree Newsom. She achieved fame in, I believe it was 2016, climbing a flagpole on the grounds of the South Carolina Capitol to tear down a Confederate flag. It was a very dramatic image and shocked many people who didn't know that Confederate flags still flew over state capitals anywhere in the country. But she too described how you don't see what you don't see. You see the action, but she was preparing with her partner for months or at least weeks. Rosa Parks also prepared for months, and the groups that backed her, who selected her to be the person who wouldn't move on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. Talk a little bit about, maybe André, let me toss this to you, that backstory of protests, the careful ground laying that goes on before the dramatic action that bursts onto our screens occurs?
Well, one of the many reasons we put our shoulders to the wheel around this book is to really demonstrate how protest works and that it works. Most of the stories, in fact, all the stories really, that the 42 stories that we showcase in the book involve much more that's sort of under the hood around how things happen than people normally interpret or learn from their history books. Um, there is always planning that goes into it. As you mentioned, Rosa Parks was a 14-year volunteer for the local NAACP, and she'd just come back from a training at the Highlander Folk Center on nonviolent resistance to segregation. What she did led to what was first going to be a one-day boycott in Montgomery, ended up being a 381-day boycott, at the end of which the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses is illegal or unconstitutional. The other thing we're trying to highlight in the book is the fact that a lot of these protesters are not honored at the time. Rosa Parks and her husband lost their jobs after this demonstration. They were hounded by death threats. They actually had to leave town and they rebuilt their life in Detroit. But it took several years of poverty and death threats and being chased around before she got a job as an assistant in the office of a congressman named John Conyers. 41 years later, I think, President Clinton gave her the Presidential Medal of Honor. And 50 years later, when she died, she was allowed to lie. She was honored with lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda. So one of the tricks that we have to understand when we think about protesters is that they are never honored at the time. And this, in her case, 50-year gap between her first work on behalf of social justice and racial justice and the being honored by being allowed to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda is just too long. It's just too long. When people see protesters now on the street, and when they hear the government say that they are terrorists and low IQ, and the President of the United States publishes these screeds against constitutionally protected protest, we all have to remember and remind each other that these protests we're seeing now that might inconvenience us a little bit in the street are tomorrow's heroes.
Annie, let me ask you, what led you to be a protester and an activist in your life?
I actually was very interested in environmental issues since I was a child and studied environmental science in school. And I was naive enough to think when I was young that policy was made based on the science. I say that environmentalists are often trapped in the myth that the truth will set us free. And so we carry up our scientific information up to Capitol Hill and show it to the legislators and don't understand why they're not moving. And I think it was the systems thinker Peter Senge said that the best way to understand a system is to try to change something in it. Very soon when I entered the environmental advocacy arena, I realized that decisions aren't being made because of science or morality. Decisions are being made because of power. And I do believe that one of the ways that the general public, concerned people, exercise their power is through protest, through civil disobedience, through disruption. I never start a campaign with protest. I always like to try the polite levers of democracy first. But when we have exhausted the polite levers of democracy, we're often morally and scientifically compelled to take direct action to force change. And over, the direct action has delivered the goods.
Back to the question, what led you as just, your own personal story?
Very personally, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in a family, and I went to a school that really valued being outdoors. So I spent a lot of time in the forest, in the Cascades, in the Olympic rainforest. And, when you spend a lot of time in the forest, you just can't help but loving that forest. And I saw clear cuts. And if you've ever seen a clear cut in a forest, it looks like just a scene of violence. And as a kid, I remember looking at these clear cuts and just thinking, who would do that? And, originally it was because I liked the animals. Now it's because I understand that forests play an essential role at keeping the planet livable. But that early imprint of seeing this just scene of devastation, early on I said, I'm going to stop that. And what I learned is that if you want to stop that, you got to protect our democracy, because our democracy should be the best tool that we have for advancing the causes we care about, and increasingly it's unavailable to us. So that's why I went from being a tree hugger in the Northwest to defending our democracy.
André, what about you? What led you to first take action and now continue it for all these years?
That is such a good question. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and around 55 years ago last month, the anti-Vietnam War protests were well along, and they declared a day in May, 55 years ago, the May Day protest. And the protesters said they were going to shut down 21 critical bridges and traffic circles in Washington under the slogan, if the government won't stop the war, we will stop the government. One of those traffic circles was about 2 blocks from my house that I grew up in. And so when I was about 10 years old, I wandered down to the corner to see what was going on, and I watched American University students crowd into Ward Circle, block the critical traffic circle, and I watched the commuters all upset, and I watched what was called then the Civil Defense Unit marching down the street with their billy clubs and then fire off tear gas and scatter the students. And I remember thinking as a kid, wow, this is like, I want to be on the side of those students. And it really struck me that this is a noble and honorable fight for justice, and in that case, against the Vietnam War. What I learned later was that Nixon and his Washington people illegally jailed 12,000 protesters, threw them into the RFK Stadium and the DC Convention Center, and corralled them there for 2 days illegally. People around the Washington area brought them, it was actually raining and it was cold, and people in Washington brought them food and brought them water and brought them blankets. And the ACL sued the government and was able to obtain the largest mass dismissal of charges in American history. So for me, it was kind of like, I admitted I was 10 years old, but there was something about this experience that embedded in me that there is a right and wrong, and that protest is one of the powerful tools we have to right a wrong.
Let me ask you, Annie, there are often tensions within protest movements, among them over representation from underrepresented groups. That includes women. You have been a woman in leadership in the protest movements, and I'm sure you've experienced over the years that perhaps you don't have the loudest voice in the room, but you still have to fight to be heard. And then there's, of course, the struggles for Indigenous people and people of color who also come into these movements. And it's a lot within the movements to make sure that both leadership looks like the people that it's representing. Say a little bit about your experience in that and how you address that issue when it comes up.
Yeah, I have experienced some of that. I mean, there have definitely been meetings that I've been in where I've convinced some large white man to put my idea forward so that it would be heard. But I'm pretty pushy myself, so I continue to plow forward. That theme, though, came up over and over in the book. For example, the women's suffragist procession in 1913. Some of the white women suffragists didn't want to include black women suffragists for fear of alienating their moderate supporters. And that fear of alienating moderate supporters is something that still plagues some in our movement today. And it has definitely never been a justifiable fear. It has never been a good strategy to try to placate the more moderate supporters. You've got to just keep moving forward. I do think there is a growing awareness that the more that our movements can embody the kind of social relations and values and equity that we want to see in the world that we're fighting for, the more likely we are to actually succeed.
Some people will have heard of you, Annie, not through Greenpeace or the protest book, but through the story of stuff, the documentary that you created in 2007 that people still talk about. Tell us what the story of stuff is.
Yeah, 2007, and I still get messages on Facebook or LinkedIn from somebody somewhere in the world who just saw it almost every day. Um, when I was at Greenpeace during my first stint there, I was an international toxics campaigner, and I was fighting against the international trade in hazardous wastes. So I had the amazing job of tracking hazardous waste that was exported from the United States and Europe to the global south. So I spent time in South Africa, where a company in New Jersey was sending hazardous waste, in Haiti, where the city of Philadelphia had exported incinerator ash, all over South and Southeast Asia, where the United States was sending all kinds of hazardous waste. And so I really did see hundreds of dumps where our waste was being dumped overseas. And while I was in those communities working with people to understand the risk, they would ask me to come look at the factories nearby too and help me to explain why the cows are getting sick or the workers are getting sick. And so I'd spent about a decade traveling the world looking at the factories where our stuff is made and the dumps where our stuff is dumped. And I thought, oh my God, people in the US have no idea. Our relationship to stuff is from the store, or now from Amazon, from your mailbox to your house to your garbage can. And we think that's the whole thing. But all of our stuff has a life before it comes to us and a life after we toss it out. So I started experimenting with ways to explain this. And often environmentalists are really a drag. We are so whiny and wonky and scoldy. And I didn't want the message to be about, shame on you for having a cell phone. I wanted it to be inviting. And so I partnered with this great group called Free Range Studios, and we made a 20-minute film. 20 minutes sounds long, but it's a very fast 20-minute. It's a cartoon that moves through what I call the materials economy, that moves through all the stuff in our world, from extraction to production to distribution to consumption and disposal. And if folks haven't seen it, I encourage you to look at Story of Stuff online. And it really increases our awareness about where all our stuff came from and where it goes afterwards. And it's still the most watched online environmental film ever. I can't believe it. My friends and I just made this as a little side project.
What's kind of the bottom line message of it?
The bottom line is three things: is that we're using too much stuff. We're taking things out of the earth faster than it can replenish it. We're using too much stuff. We're using too toxic stuff. The stuff that we are using is disrupting human and environmental health, and we're not even having fun. That's the real rub, because if our, out of control consumer mania was really being a good time for most of the people, we might just say, oh, the hell with it, let's go down, but at least we're enjoying the ride. But we have this out of control consumerism that is harming the planet, harming each other, and it's not even making us happy. So there's just no reason not to put our shoulders to the wheel to think of a different way to live.
Let me turn back to Andre here and the present moment that we find ourselves in. People are looking at daily threats to democracy, ranging from masked ICE agents roaming the streets, killing citizens, to now, President Trump proposing a using taxpayer money to pay off insurrectionists, a war in Iran, and on and on and on. And people are feeling outraged, overwhelmed. How do you and where do you tell concerned citizens to begin to protest this, to channel their, the range of emotions from grief to outrage?
Well, it's not unreasonable to be frustrated. It's not unusual to be slightly scared and overwhelmed by this. What Annie mentioned before, and I think it's important to stress, is that there are so many ways to get involved. And we have a model from the people in New Orleans and Los Angeles and Minneapolis who are joining with others in so many creative and, in some ways, hidden ways to be involved in combating authoritarianism. I did a little thought experiment and did some research about a month and a half ago to look at how many different ways the people of Minneapolis protested ICE's invasion of the city. And I found 27 different ways they were doing it. From people driving their neighbors' kids to school because they didn't want to leave the house. I have a friend named Andrew Moring who is a lawyer, and he describes his colleagues doing legal work in the back of their cars, pulling up to houses and doing some whatever is required legal work for people inside the house who are scared to come out or come out past their doorstep. There are people who delivered food for their neighbors. There are people who went to the detention center with a blanket and a cup of hot soup when someone was released. The idea that we have to all be at the front line somehow is, in some ways, ceding the terrain to Mr. Trump and his allies. So what we are saying is if you're feeling alone and if you're feeling isolated, don't be alone. Find a neighbor. Find a mailing list that is describing what's available to in your community, because there's a lot of them, and do what it takes to support the universe of people who are, perhaps more inclined to go in the street or perhaps more inclined to be arrested because they have the social capital, the economic flexibility to risk arrest in a way other people don't. There's lots of ways to be involved.
Annie, let me wrap this up by asking you to pull from this amazing collection of stories of activism and protest one that stands out to you as having a lot to teach us right now.
That's so hard because everyone is so good, and we particularly picked them to offer a variety of entree points into thinking about protest. I like to call it a protest tasting menu. But in terms of one that's relevant right now, I think I'll talk about the Jerry rescue, which was, what year was it, Andre? I forgot what year. It was
1851, I think.
1851 in Syracuse, New York. And this was when the fugitive slave law had been passed. And so it became legal under this law for slave catchers from the South to come up and capture freedmen in the North and take them back down to the South, to the person who they had escaped from. And there was a previously enslaved person, a man who went by Jerry, who'd lived in Syracuse for a number of years, had a business, was a trusted member of the community. Everything was fine, and then he was arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act and jailed. And the community members in Syracuse, much like the residents and neighbors in Minneapolis, got together and said, absolutely not. He is a part of our community. And they actually broke into the jail and helped him escape. And the reason we included this is because it might come to that. We cannot allow our community members, our family members, to be abducted out of their homes and illegally detained. So I thought that was a really inspiring one for this particular moment.
Okay, I lied. I said you'd have the last word, but Andre is raising his hand and he has one he'd like to add too.
Well, what I love is thinking about the Boston Tea Party, because it's the second entry in the book. And it is the event that people around the world cite as either an inspiration or an example, or in the history books of every child in the United States, the iconic moment, the launch of the country. What's interesting about that story is actually at the time, both Benjamin Franklin and George Washington disapproved of the Boston Tea Party. Benjamin Franklin even offered to pay back the East India Company the money they lost. And George Washington, and you will remember this phrase, feared that it would alienate his more moderate supporters. So there is an example there that I just want to highlight, which is we need to both honor the protesters in the moment and also know that protest works. That the ability of protest to provide cover for people who want to do something but fear that they might be out over their skis, brings people out in the streets, reminds people that there's an issue out there they want to fight for their brothers and sisters who might have less ability to fight for it than they do. Protest works, and one of the reasons we wrote this book is just to remind everyone that it does.
Well, Annie Leonard and André Carothers, I want to thank you for joining us on the Vermont Conversation.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thanks for having us, David.
Annie Leonard spent nearly a decade as the executive director of Greenpeace US. She's also the creator of the viral documentary, The Story of Stuff. André Carothers spent 13 years with Greenpeace US, including 4 on its board. Their new book is Protest, Respect It, Defend It, Use It, published by Patagonia Books. That does it for this week's Vermont Conversation. I'm David Goodman. Thanks so much for listening.